Welcome to Candid Conversation number 436. I was asked a question about what about evil rulers like a Hitler or Stalin? In Romans 13, it says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. The powers that be are ordained of God. Those who resist the higher powers resisteth the ordinance of God." And so the question is, well, does that mean that if the powers that be are ordained of God, when you have somebody like a Hitler or a Stalin, does that mean that God put an evil ruler in? And then by implication, is God evil? When it says the powers that be are ordained of God, I take that to mean that the governmental structure, the system of nationalism, was created by God in Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. And so I don't take it to mean that God is individually appointing leaders, although he may have a hand in that and he may be guiding things like that. But you can't just blame God for something that an evil person does. First you have to understand that everybody is evil. In your flesh dwells no good thing. Maybe somebody like Hitler or Stalin manifests the evil worse, kills more people than other leaders, but they're not any more evil than anybody else. We've had 45 presidents in the United States. Every one of them is evil. Maybe they haven't done all the damage that Hitler or Stalin did, with the exception of Lincoln. He's probably the worst president we've ever had. But they are still sinners. Every one of them, no matter how good a president is. I think Trump is a great president, but he's a sinner, just like anybody else. So, evil is a relative term. We compare ourselves among ourselves. That's what people who walk by the flesh do. And they look at a Hitler or a Stalin and say, oh, that person's evil. Whereas they look at somebody that they like a president that they like, and say, oh, he did great things. Well, he's still a sinner, So evil is a relative thing, and since all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, it's hard to label somebody as evil and another person as not. When you look at things the way they are, everybody is evil apart from Christ. But I take it to mean when it says the powers that be are ordained of God, and if you resist the power, you resist the ordinance of God. All that really means is that God has set up a governmental structure. God gave man free will, and then he has set up checks and balances on that free will. I think a good way to think of those so-called evil rulers is to compare them to parents or to husbands, because God set up marriage. God set up the man, the husband, to be Lord over the wife. Then he set up family, where he set the parents to be Lord over the children. And then he set up nations, where he set up the nation, the governmental structure of a nation, to be Lord over the people that are in the nation. And all of those are checks against the free will. And since we're talking about governmental rulers, you look specifically at nationalism, that in Genesis 11, the whole earth was of one speech and of one language. And God says, if I don't divide them into different languages, create different nations with different languages, then they will be a united front against God. And there will be nothing of their evil imaginations that they will not be able to accomplish, meaning that they will never be saved, because they would be so far away from God, and they're united with each other in doing the sin nature. So God says, I am going to create nations, and that way they're divided, and that way there's wars between different nations. And that conflict will then keep them from warring against God as much, or be united in their rebellion against God. And so when it says the powers that be are ordained of God, and if you don't obey the ruler, you're resisting the ordinance of God, it just means that God has set up these 3 checks against your free will. The husband being Lord over the wife, the parents being Lord over the children, and the nation being Lord over all the people in the nation. And God has set that up specifically to keep the free will from being used in such a way that man will never believe the gospel. So in that respect then, that is it's a good structure. Now man will come along, because there is none good, no not one. There is none righteous, no not one. Man will come along and will not be perfect in whatever role it is God has given him. But that doesn't mean we should go against it. So just like the husband is Lord over the wife. If the husband says, this is what we are going to do, the wife should not question it, because he is her Lord. It doesn't matter if he is right or not. He has the authority over her. She should not question him. She should obey him in everything. It's the same thing when it comes to the parents. The parents make the rules for the children. The children may think the rules are stupid and they don't want to follow them. It doesn't matter what the kids think. The parents are Lord over them. They are supposed to obey their parents without question. And it's the same thing when it comes to rulers. The ruler is the Lord over the people in the nation. It doesn't matter whether or not you think it's a good law. If you disobey it, or if you say, well, that's an evil ruler, so I shouldn't follow that one, well then what you're doing is you're resisting God. Now, having said that, there are exceptions to these things. Peter told the religious leaders we ought to obey God rather than man. When the Antichrist is on the scene and he says, bow down to the image of the beast or be killed, or take the mark of the beast, or you can't buy food or have any money, well then, and God says on the other side, if you take the mark or worship the image of the beast, you're going to have your place in the lake of fire. Then obviously you don't obey the ruler. You don't say, well, I'm resisting God because the powers that be are ordained of God and I'm going against that ruler. What Paul means in Romans 13 is, again, you ought to obey God rather than man. And so it simply means, those are the exceptions. Jeremiah 17:9 says, your heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And so what people will do is they'll come up with these extreme examples like that and say, well, they're not supposed to take the mark of the beast or worship the image of the beast. And so they resist the power in that case. So then I can resist the power when the speed limit says it's 55 and I want to do 80. Because, people will use these extreme examples to say that, well, we're going to, since we ought to obey God rather than man, and God would have me do something different in this case. The extreme example of Hitler, if you've got, like Corrie ten Boom and her family hid the Jews in their house, and when they came in, to try to get them, they said, oh, there aren't any Jews here. They lied. Rahab did that. Rahab, when the spies of Israel were in her house, she says, oh, they already left. They didn't leave. They're right there. But she lied, and in James 2, she's commended for her faith. So there are exceptions. It doesn't mean you always obey your husband, or you always obey your parents, or you always obey the ruler of the nation. But as long as it doesn't conflict with God's will for all men to be saved and to come into the knowledge of the truth, you go ahead and obey it, even though you don't like it. In Israel was their own nation. God set them apart, had their own rulers. But then when it came time for the Babylonian captivity, due to their rebellion against God, you had the nation was resisting that. They didn't want to be ruled by, ruled by a different nation. So Israel resisted that. But you have people like Daniel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, who went along with it. Daniel is a good example. He did not resist and say, we got to fight. Israel is God's nation, because that's what people do today. People lift up Israel as God's nation. They say, oh, we got to fight for Israel. Well, you don't see Daniel doing that. Daniel didn't say, oh, well, how dare Babylon come in and try to destroy Israel. We need to fight against them because we need to stand for God's nation. No, he saw God's plan and showed that he saw the 5th cycle of chastisement in Leviticus 26, that they were going to be scattered among the heathen due to their sin. And he said, okay, well, that's what's going on now. So I'm not resisting, I'm not going against God by allowing Israel to be taken captive by the Babylonians. And so he goes ahead, he goes into captivity. But when it comes to him serving under Nebuchadnezzar, and they try to get him to eat meat sacrificed to idols, which is against God's law, then he doesn't do it. But he doesn't say, oh, I'm rebelling, I'm going back to Israel, I'm not listening to you, Nebuchadnezzar. He doesn't do that. But he says he respects the power over him and gives an alternative plan to the person over him, and saying, look, this is against our law. Can we eat pulse instead of the meat sacrificed to idols? And they end up doing that. So basically what God wants you to do when it comes to resisting the powers that be ordained of God, is God wants you to obey the nation over you, unless it's going against God's will in some way. And then you still try to obey as close as you can. But, like in the Antichrist case, Jesus says, when that abomination desolation is set up and standing in a holy place, then you flee to the mountains. He doesn't say, oh, make sure you obey the call to go ahead and bow down to the image of the beast. But at the same time, he doesn't say, now you form a coup and you overthrow that government. He doesn't say that either. The powers that be ordained of God, and so then they go ahead and flee away. They don't obey individually because that would be against God's will. So you have to weigh those things. And also, when it comes to somebody like a Hitler or a Stalin, you also have to keep in mind that God's will is for all men to be saved and to come into the knowledge of the truth. Again, all rulers are evil in that as long as they are unsaved people, they are going to live according to the flesh. Some are going to do more dastardly things according to the flesh than others, but they're still all evil. A Hitler or a Stalin did more things, but it doesn't mean that someone else who replaced him was good, like in Gorbachev, and he worked with Ronald Reagan in the Cold War. It doesn't mean that Gorbachev is a good ruler and Stalin is an evil ruler. It's just that one did more evil things than the other. And also, when you look at it, you also don't know really what goes on behind the scenes and where the evil is. In my opinion, it'd take a lot of time to go into this and explain, but I think a Hitler or Stalin, all they were puppets. They were people who controlled they had the power over who becomes ruler and who doesn't, because they control the monetary system. They control the money supply. And so they're the ones who raise up a Hitler or a Stalin to accomplish the evil. The evil that's done, Hitler and Stalin are just doing what their handlers tell them to do, basically. So you don't really, I don't look at a Hitler or a Stalin as being super evil, because what about the people behind them? Wouldn't they be worse than them, Who are those people? I don't know. But, whoever controls the money controls the world. So, and I'll just leave it at that. But You also got to consider that God's will is for all men to be saved and to come into the knowledge of the truth. And a lot of that happens under the most evil rulers. You look at Israel. They rebelled against God. You look in the book of Judges. Israel has peace in the land. They're doing good. And then they turn their back on God. They won't serve God. And so then God brings trouble upon them. And all of a sudden they turn back to God. Oh, God, we're sorry. Come deliver us. God delivers them. They have peace in the land. They forget about God again. They don't obey God. So then God brings another evil ruler in to destroy them or to take them captive. Oh, God, we're sorry we did this. Please forgive us. Please deliver us. He delivers them again. God tried to give the promised land to Israel by faith, but they wouldn't take it. They say, would to God we had died in Egypt, because we'd rather be a slave in Egypt because then we ate better there than to be out here in this wilderness and eat this manna. They didn't have any faith in God. God wasn't punishing them. He got them out with a strong hand. The Lord is a man of war, it says in Exodus 15. He sent those 10 plagues upon Egypt and punished Egypt and got Israel out. Israel wasn't grateful. Whenever Israel had good times in their land, they turned their back on God. They served Molech and Ashtaroth. Molech and Ashtaroth and Baal. They served all these pagan deities. They stopped believing in God when God brought them into Babylonian captivity. When they came out 70 years after that captivity and they came back into the land, they repented. They went back to the law and they mourned about how they had forsaken the Lord. And when you come to the worst ruler of all, the Antichrist, that's the greatest time of Jewish salvation this world will ever see. 144,000 Jews are saved and sealed by the Holy Spirit halfway through the tribulation period. In a period of 3.5 years of tyrannical rule by the Antichrist, 144,000 Jews are saved. It's just like when Joseph was, who is a type of Jesus, by the way, the most complete type of Jesus in your Bible. Joseph sold into slavery. They wanted to kill him. They didn't kill him, but they put him into slavery. Sold to Egypt. They were really getting back at Joseph. They hated him because he was a God-fearing man, is the real reason. He was a believer and the rest of his 11 brethren were not. Well, maybe not all 11. Benjamin probably. I don't know. He was too young. But anyway, his other brethren were not believers for the most part. And Joseph was. And so they hated him because of that. And he goes sold into slavery by Egypt. Well, into Egypt by them. Well, then he ends up being a great ruler in Egypt. And afterward, they feel like they're in trouble with Joseph. They're like, well, he's a ruler now, and we did some pretty bad things to him. He may kill us. And Joseph makes the statement somewhere around Genesis 48. Or 49 or 50. I think it's either 49 or 50. He says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And that's how it is when you come to these evil rulers. The Antichrist. He's going to kill people who don't bow down to the image of the beast. He's a tyrannical person. He's going to have world control. Why would God say to obey this ruler? Well, he doesn't say to bow down to the image of the beast, but he does say that you're resisting God if you try to overthrow him, because the powers that be are ordained of God. Well, the reason God allows evil ones like a Hitler or a Stalin or the Antichrist to come up is because it is only in adversity, it seems like, when people actually turn to God. If I've got millions of dollars, perfect health, everything is going fine, God, who's he? There is no God. That's what the world's saying now in this time of prosperity. There is no God. I just do whatever I want to do. But if I lose a loved one, or if I get sick, or if I lose my money, If all the things that I trust in this world pass away, then I turn to God. Look at what happened with Job. You had Satan comes to God, basically says, I've been walking to and fro on the earth. I control the world. God, you think you are over these humans? No, I'm God. I control the earth. I'm over the world. God says, well, what about Job? He serves me. Oh, well, that's because you've blessed him. Take away all his blessings, he won't serve you anymore. God allows Satan to curse Job, to bring bad things upon Job. But you have him, in the end, he says, when I am tried, I shall come forth as gold. Malachi 3 says that the Lord sits as a refiner and a purifier of Israel. He's purifying out the impurities during that tribulation period so that they come forth as gold and silver and precious stones. So yes, God's people go through these trials and tribulations. But God isn't evil in doing so. It's not that God is evil in bringing in the evil ruler or allowing the Antichrist to rule. The tribulation period starts in Revelation 6:2, where Satan is given a crown and he goes forth conquering and to conquer. God allows him to bring up the Antichrist and rule the whole world through him. That doesn't mean God is evil, but God recognizes, he says, I tried to give Israel the land without anything bad coming upon them, but they wouldn't believe me. And so in order for them to be saved, I have to allow these evil rulers to come in, the Antichrist to come in, and institute capital punishment before Israel will actually believe me. Joseph says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. They did an evil thing, but God turned it around for good. Hitler and Stalin, under Stalin, I believe, or Lenin really is the one that started it, under the Bolshevik Revolution there. About 100 million people over a period of, 50, 60 years were killed. That's a great evil. That should not have happened. God has worked it out for the good. How did he work it out for good? I don't know. I'm not over there. I don't know what happened there. But I know that God allowed it to happen because it worked out his greater purpose of people being saved and coming into the knowledge of the truth. We look at the Jews and the Holocaust and think that's a terrible thing that Hitler did, and certainly it is a terrible thing. But if it results in the Jewish salvation, it's actually works out for the good. It's still a horrible thing, but it was necessary in order for people to be saved. My uncle, who got me into right division, was saved and took the Bible as his final authority and learned the sound doctrine and right division, all because his father became paralyzed. His father tried to get him to be saved before, go to church. He wouldn't do it. But when things got bad, he did it. Certainly God doesn't like the evil brought upon the world and those things coming upon us. But whom the Lord loveth, he chastiseth, because he recognizes that even death and torture in this world, while it's bad, pales in comparison to the torture that will happen for all eternity in hell. And so God would rather you have to die early or be tortured or have all this evil come upon the world if it results in the salvation of people. When the world got so evil in Noah's day, it says that the long suffering of God waited while the ark was preparing, in which 8 souls were saved. God suffered through man's wickedness for 100 years, allowing great evil to go upon the world for 100 years, because that was the only way that 7 more people would be saved. There would have only been Noah before them, but now there's 7 others that get saved with Noah. So we look at the material world and think, oh, Hitler and Stalin are bad, and certainly they were. They were awful people. Lenin really before Stalin. Awful people who killed millions of people. They were just awful. But all of us are evil, And God didn't cause them to do those things. They used their free will decisions to do it. But God allowed that great evil to happen because it results in people being saved. And so we should always obey the rulers over us unless it does result in God's will not being accomplished. But in most cases, most every case, we need to obey the rulers over us. Hopefully that helped to answer that question. Thanks for watching.